What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video I'm going to be doing another discussion, and I'm pretty sure this one will be pretty controversial, because I feel like it's about one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most hated aspects. Now, it's not always an aspect that manifests in every format, but going through, the historical formats like I'm doing on this channel, we will indeed encounter it, a fair amount of the time. And that topic is FTKs. Now, FTK, if you don't know, stands for first turn kill. And it's basically a combo that is somewhat consistent, that can basically win you the game on the first turn. So, for instance, I'm not talking here about, Exodia in Critter format because you could hard draw all 5 pieces of Exodia, right? But there isn't really a consistent way to get all 5 pieces to hand, on the first turn in some Yu-Gi-Oh's earliest formats. There are some combos you can do later on in the game's history that can potentially set that up, but even then it's kind of hard to do that first turn. So I wouldn't call Exodia really an FTK, but something like Scientist FTK, which was introduced in the latest format that I've been covering, Breaker format, would be an FTK. The idea behind Scientist FTK is if you can get out Magical Scientist and Catapult Turtle on your field on the first turn, then you can bring out enough fusion monsters off Magical Scientist and treat them off with Catapult Turtle to deal enough damage to exactly kill your opponent. And that can be pretty degenerate, as in Breaker format, since it is in the DM era, there aren't really any hand traps, or at least any hand traps that really help you out against the Scientist FTK. So it can just lead to games where you're just not able to interact with your opponent at all, and they just win the game on the spot. And that can be kind of unfortunate, and it's definitely not something that everyone wants to experience. So I'm not trying to make this video to say, everyone should go out there and play Breaker format. It's one of the best formats of all time. I don't really think that either, because, I don't think any format with an FTK can be one of the greatest formats of all time. However, I do think that just writing off a format entirely because there is an FTK deck in it is not necessarily the best sort of philosophy to have. I think that, there are definitely some very degenerate formats with FTKs, but also, FTKs lead to a very interesting sort of metagame because, there's the FTK strategies and then there are the people playing against the FTK strategies. And if you've got a deck like Magical Scientist, which likely won't FTK more than 50% of the time, I feel like 50% is probably like a hard cap based on the testing that we've done. Of course, future builds could definitely arise that completely change that, and, I'll take back that statement if they do. But if you've got a deck that's FTKing like around 50% of the time, it actually leads to a very interesting dynamic, as there likely will be potential games in a match that you play against it where you actually will have a chance to beat it. And it also leads to an interesting sort of decision for the Scientist player, because you could go all in on the FTK strategy, just trying to win on the first turn, as much as possible. Or you could try and, sort of dilute the FTK strategy a little bit, so you can still do it a fair amount of the time. But also you've got backups for in case you can't do it. Just playing generically good cards for if you do have to, play the game for longer than one turn. So I think this actually leads to some very interesting dynamics, and there are ways that decks can sort of play cards that stop Scientist FTK. Like, for instance, if they go first, something out of King Tiger Wang who can really shut down Scientist FTK's game plan. A lot of Scientist FTK decks aren't playing things with over 1400 attack that they'd want to summon. And if you think about the monsters that really facilitate the FTK, it's like Gillosaurus, Cannon Soldier, and Scientist and Catapult Turtle, none of which have over 1400 attack. So, there's kind of interesting decisions to be made there in terms of counterplaying against the FTK strategies. And do you think that the FTKs will be prevalent enough that you play cards like King Terror Wanghu in the main deck at 3 copies to sort of pre-side against that match, or do you just relegate it to the side deck? And this is something that would happen, later on in the game's history as well. For instance, with Frog FTK, which comes much later in the game's history, there's a couple decisions that you can make in terms of, main decking hand traps. There are some hand traps in that format, although, they aren't necessarily as good as the hand trap of the modern day. Things like DD Crow can be extremely powerful against this deck, and even Hanawata can shut off the deck's sort of main win con very easily, because the Frog FTK deck is basically trying to use Mass Driver to burn your opponent to death by, bringing out a ton of frogs on board, things like Substitoad, Rodentone, etc. And Hanawata basically stops Mass Driver from being able to pull off the combo. The interesting thing about that for the Frog FTK player as well is that Frog FTK doesn't necessarily have to win through the damage condition. They can also just set up a very powerful board and basically defy the opponent to break it. And oftentimes they can't break it, given the tools that are available in that format. And then the Frog player can sort of play a, very interesting control game and just grind them out. So I think that, there are interesting factors at play with a variety of different FTK decks and a variety of formats. Also, oftentimes the FTKs aren't necessarily consistent enough to see tournament success. Like in GOAT format, Library FTK is a thing that can be very strong and very annoying to play against, but it hasn't really won any tournament to my knowledge. Now, a part of that is for a while it was banned because there was an exploit on Dueling Book where if you play Convulsion of Nature, there is like some shenanigans you can do where you'll be able to see like the order of all the cards in your deck, which of course is not a good thing to do. But, I think that exploit's been fixed, and I think now Library FTK is legal in certain GOAT format tournaments. Don't quote me on that because I haven't covered GOAT yet, but I believe that is the case. And, I think even if this thing is legal, it's not necessarily going to, be topping any tournaments anytime soon because it is kind of not the best deck in the format, right? Like things like Chaos Turbo are much, much better because they can play out a variety of different situations. With Library FTK, you do need to see a certain number of cards at the start to actually be able to pull off the FTK. And if you don't get those cards, you're playing a pretty bad deck, and your opponent can likely kill you pretty easily. And then if you're a Library FTK player trying to make that work, then the question becomes, okay, how do I adjust my deck to potentially, play out those games where I don't just FTK on the first turn? So there are a lot of interesting decisions to consider when playing an FTK deck and playing against an FTK deck. And so I actually think that like they're an interesting inclusion to some formats. Now, again, as I said, I don't think they're going to be in the all-time great formats because a lot of people really hate them, and for good reason. Like Yu-Gi-Oh is a game about interaction, and even in the modern day, with people memeing about, oh, games don't last more than 2 turns, there is still a fair amount of interaction oftentimes in those 2 turns. The existence of modern day hand traps make it very interesting for both you and your opponent to sort of navigate the combos of a given turn, because if you've got a hand trap in hand, you want to save it for the most important point of your opponent's combo. And if you're the opponent, you want to sort of play around the different hand traps that exist. So I do think that like interaction is a core of this game and a real reason why a lot of people like it. And FTKs sort of reduce that interaction down to nothing. However, there are other degenerate decks in a variety of formats that also aim to do that sort of thing. I mean, Empty Jar is, it can kind of be an MTK sometimes. But if your opponent doesn't manage to FTK with the Empty Jar strat, then it is just kind of like a degenerate deck that's trying to just prevent your opponent from playing as much as possible and depriving them as many resources as possible. And, to a lot of people, that's not really that fun. Even though they have the illusion of interactivity, a lot of decks like Morphing Jar, like potentially even Last Turn as well, which is also around in things like GOAT and some other formats, they also just aim to sort of shut down your opponent's ability to interact with you and just sort of play your own game. And I'd argue that that probably is maybe even more degenerate than some of the FTK strategies, because at least with the FTK strategies, it's over quickly, right? Like if they FTK you, and you're like, okay, well, on to game 2, I'll side against that, and I'm going first because I lost and stuff. But with the Empty Jar and Last Turn decks, those games can drag out quite a bit, and that can be kind of more annoying to you, even though, you could potentially draw the one out you need to it, but oftentimes you won't quite do that. And I think that also, applies to sort of pseudo FTKs, like the Gumblar loop that comes much, much later in the game's history. Now, I never personally played any of the Link era formats like in too much detail, so I don't know the most about Gumblar FTK. But it basically just deprived your opponent of all their cards in hand. And that's basically like an FTK against most decks, even though it technically doesn't, kill them that turn. But it is kind of interesting how consistent that was and how hated it was. And yeah, people still played that format. And again, I don't know the most about this format, but like while it was very consistent, it was also a very difficult deck to actually master. And there were actually very interesting decision lines in sort of pulling off your combos from what I understand. Again, I never played at this time in the game's history. I know it was extremely degenerate, and I'm not trying to defend it or say it's actually a good format. I'm just saying, these sorts of things exist throughout the game's history, but they do provide a sort of interesting version of the game that I think can be sort of interesting to dive into, especially if you also have access to playing the good formats in the game's history. And that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of going through each format as I'm doing on this channel, because I do think that one of the best things about this game is that it does have such a long history. And if you dive into any one of those historical formats, there's really a different way to play. Like, no two format is exactly the same. And I think that can be very refreshing. If you're playing a lot of modern and you want something a bit slower, there's GOAT, there's Edison, there's also the DM formats that I've covered. If you want something a bit, less explored than GOAT or Edison, there's things like Yada format, which I think has a lot of potential to be a really good format in the DM era. And if you want something, like very anime-esque, you can play like Yugi Kaiba format. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to play this game, and having those different outlets for playing the game makes playing some FTK formats, not as tilting, I think. If you're playing modern and there's an FTK in modern, that's really unfortunate because, if you want to be playing the modern version of the game, there's really only that format to play for modern, right? But if you're playing retro formats, I think diving into a retro format that has an FTK is a lot less annoying because you have options to play other retro formats as well. So I'd encourage you, if you've never played in one of these formats with an FTK like this, where an FTK is really dominant, just try them out sometime. You don't have to play more than one game, but it is kind of interesting, and it's an interesting experience that I think that, well, I mean, I'm not trying to encourage you to do something that will tilt you, but like, if you, go into it with the right mindset, I think it is kind of cool to either FTK your opponent or be on the receiving end of that as well, and just see those decks sort of go through the motions to accomplish their goal, which is just so different from like pretty much anything that a lot of other decks are doing. So that's my sort of pitch for, potentially playing FTKs or FTK formats, because, there are other options out there if it's not for you, and I think it is something very unique, and it's part of the game's history, so it's fun to sort of experience that history for yourself. Again, I don't think that FTKs are necessarily, the healthiest things in the world. I don't think they make for the best formats out there, and, I'm not even trying to say that there should be more FTKs either, but, I'm just sort of trying to sort of play devil's advocate for why you would potentially want to play any of these formats, and potentially maybe, open your mind to other sorts of gameplay styles across a variety of old retro formats. But if you enjoyed this video, definitely let me know what you thought of my discussion here in the comments below. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people complain about FTKs in the comments, but I'm happy to hear those complaints. I'm happy to discuss them as well, because I do think that this is a very interesting and not often discussed part of the game's history. And, I think people should discuss it more and, sort of experiment with it more. Also, if you like this content, please do subscribe to the channel. I have a variety of retro Yu-Gi-Oh content, with new content coming out every week. So if you enjoy retro Yu-Gi-Oh, this is the place for you. And also, I'll be covering a lot more Breaker format in the coming weeks, which does have the Scientist FTK. And we're also having the Breaker tournament right now. And if you want to be involved in any other future tournaments that we hold in these retro formats, then definitely join the Discord server, link in the description down below. But I hope that you enjoyed this video as always. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on FTKs down in the comments below. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.